Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Chitheads. My very special guest today is Sharon Salzberg. Sharon Salzberg is a meditation teacher inspired by the Buddhist tradition and the author of 9 books, including Loving Kindness, the wildly popular New York Times bestseller Real Happiness at Work, and Love Your Enemies, How to Break the Anger Habit and Be a Whole Lot Happier. In 1976, she established, together with Joseph Goldstein and Jack Kornfield, the Insight Meditation Society in Barre, Massachusetts, which now ranks as one of the most prominent and active meditation centers in the Western world. Sharon and Joseph Goldstein expanded their vision in 1989 by co-founding the Barre Center for Buddhist Studies, and in 1998 they initiated the Forest Refuge, a long-term retreat center secluded in a wooded area on Insight Meditation Society property. Today, she leads and teaches a variety of offerings around the globe. She has participated in countless events, including several alongside His Holiness the Dalai Lama. She contributes and has contributed to several notable publications, such as the Oprah magazine, the Huffington Post, and is currently a weekly columnist for On Being. She has appeared in Time Magazine, Yoga Journal, MSNBC.com, Tricycle, Real Simple, Body and Soul, Mirabella, Good Housekeeping, Self, Buddha Dharma, More, and Shambhala Sun, as well as on a variety of radio programs. Sharon currently resides in Barre, Massachusetts, and New York City. So with that, hello, Sharon. Thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, well, thank you.
It's really such a pleasure to have you. You know, I read your book, Real Happiness, several years ago, and I remember it really illuminated so much about the practice of meditation for me. So it's such a pleasure to be able to speak with you.
Thank you.
So I wanted to start off with, the history of your practice and your teaching has been for so long. You really have been at the forefront of bringing a lot of these Buddhist practices, meditation practice to the West. So I would love to hear a little bit about your own personal story, what brought you to Buddhism initially, and maybe a little bit about just the trajectory of your teaching and your personal path.
Sure. Well, I went to college in the late 60s. I really almost as an accident. I took an Asian philosophy course as a sophomore. I say it was an accident because as far as I can remember looking back, it just like fit my schedule.
Right.
And it turned out to be a course in Buddhism, and it completely changed my life. It was in the context of that course that I heard that there was such a thing as meditation practice, that there were actually tools that one could use, that they didn't necessarily need to be embedded in a belief system of any kind, but there were actual practical tools that one could use to be a happier person, and which I really longed for. And I was going to school in Buffalo, New York. I looked around Buffalo. I just didn't see it. And in a practical way, there were no classes. There were no workshops, and I took another look at the university, and they had an independent study program where if you created a project that they liked, you could go anywhere in the world.
Wow.
And so I created a project. I wanted to go to India and study meditation, and they accepted that. So I left in 1970, and I began my meditation practice in early January of 1971. So it's been a long time.
It has been a long time. So one of the things that you just said that's I think is sort of an interesting topic is you mentioned that, in this class, for the first time, you encountered meditation as something separate from the tradition. So while you are, very embedded in the tradition, it seems you also go very far to kind of teach these things as practices that don't necessarily need to imply a certain religious affiliation. So what is your kind of position in that? I mean, does the Buddhist tradition help illuminate the practice? Can you do meditation practice without these lineages? Does it take away to not be affiliated with a lineage? So I'd love to hear your kind of thoughts on that.
Well, I started my practice in the context of this intensive 10-day retreat led by S.N. Goenka. And the first night of that retreat, so practically the first words I heard were, the Buddha did not teach Buddhism, the Buddha taught a way of life.
Right.
And so that's been really a foundational understanding for me all along. So I think absolutely you can do the practices without Buddhism, without any particular belief system at all. The question is really not so much the label of Buddhism, but does that way of life have something to add to really what is kind of mental training, and I think it does, and it comes out in various ways. The very classic way of saying that would be, what about ethics? That if you think, well, I can just, be really reckless all week and then sit down and, compose myself and try to concentrate my mind on Saturday, it's going to be much harder. Mm-hmm. And so the invitation within the tradition is to really look at every element of our lives, to consider it a seamless path. How we speak to our neighbor, how we speak to our children, how we allocate resources, everything has to do with our degree of mindfulness. And so our inner work and our outer work really are the same. And you can do it without that understanding. You can certainly meditate without that perspective, but I just think it's harder. So it's like the question is, for once in our lives, do we want to do something the easiest way possible rather than the hardest?
Right. So that's interesting what you mentioned, that you brought up ethics, because that's actually something I wanted to talk to you about, because a lot of your writing and your work is really about cultivating what we might call, as you mentioned, ethical virtues like kindness, compassion, equanimity. But I think there are a lot of people who are perhaps new to the practice who have a kind of bad taste in their mouth about ethics. Maybe they associate it with something like, the 10 Commandments that are sort of handed down from on high. And so they don't necessarily see the utility of it, or they think it infringes upon their freedom in some way. But what I hear you mentioning is something quite different, in that it's serving a certain utility. Is that correct? Or what is the kind of different way of approaching ethics within this way of life that you're speaking of, as opposed to kind of the sort of top-down ethics that maybe a lot of people are familiar with?
I think there are a lot of differences, and one is seeing it's like an adventure, and we're used to equating freedom with like wildness or recklessness, and what about freedom being developed through greater kindness, or so it's like a reinterpretation of many things, and it is like a big adventure. And it also within the teachings they say, if you like break a precept, if you violate some moral agreement, then you take it again. It's not like this huge shameful thing. It's a training. It's a training in awareness. And another thing that is really different is that it's rooted in compassion for ourselves. It's like, give yourself a break, don't lead as complicated a life as you're leading. Be nice to yourself. Recognize that your actions have consequences, that the fact that you've told all those lies and then you have to like sit there and think, did I lie enough? Did I lie to the right people? It's like a total drag. So it's, be good to yourself and think about a cleaner way of living.
Mm-hmm. So it's really that living in an ethical way, it's kind of an experiment that is serving you. It's not necessarily, you're not serving a higher power by being sort of morally pure. Right. You're actually serving the kind of clarity of your own mind. Is that correct?
That's right. That's right.
So that's all very interesting. So say that I was, for example, maybe because I've been this person before, and I was a person who didn't feel inspired to follow ethics in this way, because I feel like there's a sense in which if you already have the desire to live ethically, then you will. But what about those of us who, and I'm not saying I'm this person anymore, but what about those of us who don't yet desire to kind of follow an ethical path? Like, how do you begin to cultivate the desire to live ethically according to this way of life?
Well, then, it's not just a more contemporary approach, but there are lineages within Buddhist teaching as well, which say just pay attention. All you need to do is really pay attention, because if you pay attention enough, there's wisdom that grows, there's insight that comes, and we just see so much more clearly. It's like, if you are that person that I just described who's told a whole bunch of lies, and you're also really paranoid about being found out, and you sit down to meditate, that's what you see. And you see, oh, look at that, there's a residue. I thought I was home free. It was done. Look at that. It stayed with me. Oh, look at that. That came back from like 8 years ago. Oh, God. It's up to you. It's up to oneself. And the power of insight is very strong, because we see our actions do have consequences. I thought that particular action was making me so happy, and it was so fantastic, and whoa, maybe not after all. Or I thought that was so restrictive and too humble, and but look at that act of generosity really did bring me lingering joy, and so then we know.
So then the practice of attention, like you're mentioning, starting with attention, when we turn inward and we start to pay attention to what it's arising, it's not necessarily a walk in the park, right? I mean, this is sometimes confronting things that are going to take us into a place, maybe a place of darkness for a while, as we really start to face ourselves. And one thing that I definitely notice is that there's a tendency towards the quick fix prescription in our culture. So we don't necessarily want to move through the shit, do we? We sort of want to be happier immediately. So what would you say to somebody like that who's perhaps starting to be attentive for the first time, but it's really making them depressed in a certain kind of way?
Well, there's a lot to say in that.
Right.
One is there's a difference between something coming up and being lost in it, and that's the whole training. There's a skill to being able to kind of surf the feelings and memories and whatever that come in a way that you're connected, but also not drowning,
Right. Can you offer like 3 different ways that someone might do that, might surf those waves without getting lost at sea?
Yeah, well, one would be, let's say it's a strong emotion coming up. Try to feel it in your body, so you have a way of paying attention to it. A really major aspect of mindfulness training is look for the add-ons. Something is happening right now, but maybe we have the tendency to add on an indefinite future. This is going to be here forever, or a tremendous sense of isolation. I'm the only one who's ever felt this, or, so we look for what we may be adding on just through force of habit and see if we can let go or relinquish the add-ons. And then another is always be kind to yourself. These are not bad states or terrible states or awful states. They're painful states.
Yeah.
And it's not the only reality. It's not the only thing you ever feel, but it's happening right now. And so be kind to yourself in doing that. And so then, whatever may be arising, and it's okay. And it's definitely normal. I mean, that's an important thing to understand. It's not that you've gone off the rails or your meditation is miserable or you're, a horrible person. This is inevitable because we see everything. We see these glorious, beautiful moments that, come up that maybe we're usually too distracted to even appreciate, and we see these really painful things that are parts of our experience genuinely. So that happens too. It's all okay.
Wow, that's really helpful. So, now I wanted to shift gears a little bit, and I was reading one of your columns in On Being, one of your lovely columns. I've been reading them quite a bit frequently or recently, and in one of them you talk about faith and doubt, and faith is always sort of a hot topic because it seems like you get a very mixed response. A lot of people encounter that word with a lot of Judeo-Christian baggage. Maybe they, associate faith with kind of blind faith and being, socialized not to question or to be skeptical. And so I'm wondering what the status of faith is in this way of life that we're talking about, and how it differs from this kind of blind faith that a lot of people might be familiar with.
I actually wrote a book on faith.
Yes.
Because it was so fascinating to me. Within the Buddhist tradition, faith is not really like a commodity, that you either have it or you don't, or you have the wrong kind and you're going to be condemned. It's much more a journey. And interestingly enough, a big and rightful part of that journey is doubting. It's questioning. It needs to be the right kind of doubting, so... they say that faith begins at this stage, which they call bright faith, which is like a stage of intoxication. It's likened to being in an enclosed, dark, cramped room, and then something happens, so the door swings open, and you think, whoa, it's a bigger world. So maybe that's because you meet somebody, or it can happen through art, it can happen through music, it can happen through inspiration of some kind. it's just this moment of like, wow. And it's also likened to falling in love. So it's a beautiful and important state where we understand there's so many possibilities in life. It's so much bigger and greater. And yet it's also a kind of vulnerable state. It's just the beginning because, first of all, we can be kind of gullible. It's like you might meet one teacher one day and think, oh, I'm going to follow them. And then you meet another teacher another day and you think, oh, forget that other guy. I'm going to follow this one. And, and because it's not centered in oneself, it's really seemingly dependent on something external. And because of that, the biggest danger is that we can become afraid to question because any questioning seems to threaten our proximity to what seems to be the source of this glorious feeling. And so the next stage of faith is actually questioning, putting it into practice, verify for yourself, center that sensibility, that vision within yourself, not someone else. And it's always good to ask questions. And the major kind of aspect of that is put it into practice, test it out. Don't believe anything just because someone said it. And that's really an onward leading kind of doubt. The kind of doubt that isn't so onward leading is just sort of being cynical, like I don't think it's worth it, or
right.
It's almost refusing to question in some funny way. It's refusing to engage and make the experiment in something. So standing on the sidelines and just wondering is not that helpful.
Now that's interesting. I'd love to go a little further with that sort of cynical observation that you made, because it seems like those who are not, taken up by a spiritual practice, there's kind of, a general kind of cultural inclination towards deep cynicism, which seems to kind of hinge on a crude idea of like, what is scientifically verifiable and all this stuff. So what is your kind of estimation of that culturally, and how can the deeply cynical person be taken up by these practices? Is it just does it go back to what we were mentioning before, where it's just about just be attentive and that will start to shift as well, or is there something else there?
Yeah, I mean the kind of uncertainty and all of that is good. I mean, we shouldn't be gullible, but if it sometimes cynicism is really hardened, and we are just standing on the sidelines. It's a little bit like a child saying, I didn't want that anyway, when they find out they're not going to get it,
Right.
So it's also a mask for fear and self-denigration, all kinds of things. But, if it's strongly in place, very possibly somebody won't practice. But if there's more kind of suspicion rather than the rigidity, and uncertainty, then the proof is in the experience. You don't have to belong to anything. You don't have to join anything. You make the experiment, take a few risks and make the experiment. And if you decide it's complete garbage, then that's what you decide, But,
right.
The monitoring is oneself. Like, what is my experience? And not like a perpetual, continual evaluation, because then you're never really doing the thing. You're just evaluating it.
Yeah.
But structure is usually the answer to that kind of doubt. Like, can you commit to practicing every day for a month? As one example, does that seem reasonable to you? And at the end of the month, definitely evaluate and assess whether you want to go on and continue or not. But with another aspect to that, which is a little tricky, is that the changes you see, or you might see at the end of the month, or the benefits you won't see most likely in the 10 or 15 or 20 minutes a day when you're formally practicing. You'll see it in your life. You'll see it the way you speak to yourself when you make a mistake. You'll see it when you meet a stranger. You'll see it in a time of adversity, which is where it counts. That's where we want to see it.
Right.
But you have to think to look there.
Mm-hmm. So that's interesting that you mentioned the kind of practicing for a month suggestion, because that's actually what you advise or prescribe in your book Real Happiness, which is one of your older books at this point, but has been very popular. So I'd love to talk about that a little bit. Why 28 days, and also what is real happiness, and how does that differ from maybe unreal happiness or fake happiness?
I think the publisher, honestly, in all honesty, suggested 28 days.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it was like 4 weeks. It seemed good, And I think it is realistic in terms of what most people can imagine.
Yeah, true.
So Real Happiness was also the publisher's suggestion.
Oh.
The book originally was going to be called something else, and then I got an advanced copy of a friend's book with that very title on it. So,
oh, no.
Yeah, so it was like... and at first with Real Happiness, I was kind of uncertain. Like, on the one hand, I thought in life, that's actually what we want. We want something sustainable, something that will be there for some quality within that will support us even as life goes through its inevitable changes. So that's what I mean by real happiness is something that is more durable or accessible no matter what's happening. And by happiness, I don't mean pleasure, but that sense of inner resource. Right. There's something happening inside that can support us. And so I went through, it felt like endless periods on that book tour trying to explain, what I meant by real happiness, that it wasn't the conventional sense of happiness, perhaps.
I see. So then, because from what I understand of Buddhist philosophy, which differs from perhaps some texts within yoga philosophy, is that happiness is, if I'm correct, is not eternal. Like, for example, we're looking to reside in our Atman in Vedanta, and we are in a state of Satchitananda, which is sort of this perpetual truth consciousness bliss state, which would be kind of this eternal state of something or other. But from what I understand, the Buddhist philosophy differs in that they're not proposing a permanent and eternal happiness. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, certainly not in the conventional sense. I mean, it's said to be beyond words, so it's hard to describe.
Right, yeah, that's good. That's fair. Okay. But then the idea is that, like, even if you're finding real happiness, it's not that you're going to feel happy all the time.
Not in the sense of pleasure or mirthful or giddy, not at all. But if you completely redefine happiness, which actually, come to think of it, seems to be one of the submissions of my books. I wanted to recapture the term faith. Mm-hmm. And in a way, even though it wasn't my original choice, maybe, one goal turned out to be to recapture the word happiness. Yeah. No, we're not jumping up and down for joy all the time. Life is life, with its ups and downs. But I think we also know the difference. Like if something really challenging happens and you haven't slept and you feel all alone and you're lost, it's so much harder. Yeah. And if that same challenging thing happens, but you're surrounded by loving friends and you can let their love in, and, you're in some comfortable place and you have time and you're rested, it's a whole other scene, right? The same challenge. And so there's something from within that we meet things with that I think doesn't have to disappear when things are hard.
So in some sense, it's a happiness that has been appropriated in a different kind of way where it can actually contain within itself, or can support both, less than pleasant states and pleasant states.
Yeah,
I see. Perfect. All right, that's beautiful. So now I want to move into a few clarifying questions regarding, for those who are perhaps newer to your work or just to kind of the Buddhist way of life, or the way of life that the Buddha taught in general. And one of the things that I always think that always comes up for people is kind of the question of how Buddhist meditation differs from other forms of meditation. And I know there are different forms of Buddhist meditation, and I'm going to ask a question about that in a second. But just kind of in a general way, how does a meditation that the Buddha taught, or that people inspired by the Buddha taught, differ from other modes?
I'm not totally sure I know how to answer that in a comparative sense, because I've been doing this range of practices all within the Buddhist tradition for 45 years. And I've never actually done anything else.
Okay. Okay, that's fair. So then let's get into the difference between maybe Buddhist forms of meditation. So Vipassana, we hear this a lot. It's become very popular. Lots of people doing 10-day retreats and then more. And then metta meditation. What are the difference between these two forms of meditation?
Vipassana means insight. Mm-hmm. And insight meditation, the engine for insight meditation of any kind is mindfulness. There's another word one hears a lot.
Yes.
So the development of a mindful awareness leading to insight is one whole section, one whole category of meditations of the many, many ways of practicing mindfulness, and there are many. One particular school, which was Goenka's, he was my first teacher, tends to be the one associated with the term Vipassana, which is the Pali language. It's the language of the original Buddhist texts. Mm-hmm. So when you say Vipassana, I think Goenka, 10-day retreats. If you say insight meditation, I think of my center, the Insight Meditation Society, which has a whole variety of different approaches, all within that larger category.
I see.
And metta means loving kindness. So there are a whole range of practices within, I think, every Buddhist school to develop greater love and compassion and kindness. And they're kind of a dedicated period of really strengthening those qualities.
I see. So would you think of Vipassana and metta as, would you approach them sequentially if you were to start a Buddhist-inspired meditation practice? Would you do something like insight first and then metta, or are they done simultaneously, or does it just depend on the person? How does that usually work?
It sort of depends on the person in the historical era. They say in the Buddhist time, because the metta that I teach, for example, or we teach here, is a concentration practice, which means that the main goal, not the main goal if it's metta, but the goal of the concentration part of it is to steady your attention, to gather all the kind of energy and attention that's running to the past or running to the future, and gather it together and settle in the moment so that you end up weaving a kind of sense of centeredness and presence. It doesn't necessarily work with deepening insight, although of course it could, but that's not what it's designed for. You're not necessarily trying to see the changing nature of things and understand that everything's contingent and arising due to causes, and you're more just gathering that energy. Mm-hmm. And so they say in the Buddhist time that he would start people would be started with a concentration practice that suited their temperament, and usually in a way of balance. So if you were very angry or frightened, they would teach you loving kindness. And if you're full of greed, maybe you would do a death contemplation. And being with the breath is always good. It's said to be good for everybody. And after you had settled your mind enough, they would move you on to an insight meditation process where maybe you're not just paying attention to the breath and bringing your attention back there, but if something comes up that really strongly captures your attention, maybe you stay with that sensation, or you stay with that emotion for a while, looking at it, taking an interest in it, then you come back to the breath. And so that's what develops the insight part. So they say first you would do concentration and then you would do mindfulness. These days, most people start with some kind of mindfulness practice and then they learn a loving kindness practice if they want to go on to that. Because I teach so much loving kindness, I sort of inadvertently created a group of people. Like when I first formally taught loving kindness practice, it was like 1985, something like that. And here at the Insight Meditation Society, and I didn't think to have a prerequisite for the course, like, oh, you have to do some mindfulness first. And so a lot of people showed up who hadn't. Mm-hmm. And so all of a sudden there were people again starting with loving kindness practice. And now sometimes it is simultaneous. People will come to an insight meditation course, but there'll be loving kindness in the afternoon or something like that. But
that's lovely.
Mostly it can be sequential.
So was there much loving kindness? Was there much metta happening in the West in the mid '80s when you started doing it, or was it really? Were you really one of the first to really start to introduce it?
Within this community, I was the first, as far as I know.
So I have actually a question that is sort of I've been curious about for a while. In that, well, I guess the question for you would be: have you encountered many people who have trauma around the breath, and so it's difficult for them to start with something like insight into the breath or watching their breath? Is that a common enough issue?
Yes, I think it is fairly common, and so some of the basic principles, as I understand them, underlying the choice of the breath, first of all, as my early teachers would say, it's universal. You don't have to believe anything. You don't have to call yourself a Buddhist or Hindu or reject anything else. If you're breathing, you can be meditating. And then, as one teacher said, I always felt very charmingly, he said, the breath is very portable. So if you are taking that 10 minutes, let's say a day, formally practicing, then you're at work and things are going crazy, or you're commuting and you're getting all anxious, you can remember, take a few breaths, right? So it's right there with you. And then the third reason is that the breath is fairly neutral, because we want some object that is like a place for chilling out. So many wondrous and beautiful things arise in the practice, so many difficult things arise in the practice, and then we have the breath where we can just chill. So what you're saying, which is true, is that for a lot of people the breath is not neutral.
Yeah.
And so we just try to find another object that will suit those three. Sometimes it's listening to sound, sometimes it's something else happening in the body. There are lots of options.
And does it often happen that by choosing another object, ultimately that focus of the insight in turn kind of dissolves the trauma around the breath? Do you find that happening a lot, and then that they can then turn at a later stage to the breath?
That might be. It's just sort of the general evolution of being able to let go more easily, feeling more of a refuge within, all that.
So now a kind of maybe general historical question. We were talking about history a little bit. Is a lot of the practices that you're affiliated with would be called Theravada, if I'm correct. So, and then we have this other tradition. Well, we have a couple, but the other main tradition would be called, is referred to as Mahayana. So I'm curious what maybe a few thoughts about the difference between these two traditions, how we ended up with two different traditions, and maybe what their approach is in terms of this practice or way of life.
Well, it's kind of complicated. I mean, the teachings of the Buddha moved from India to Southeast Asia to Northern Asia and here, and each place it kind of took on a certain sort of flavor and cultural overtone and so on. So the Mahayana means greater vehicle, and so. The term you hear a lot, which we've replaced with Theravada, is Hinayana, which is lower vehicle or lesser vehicle.
Oh, so that doesn't sound very good.
No, we don't think of ourselves that way. And some Mahayana teachers, some Tibetan teachers will say, oh, well, it's not meant to be about a whole school. It's meant to be about an attitude, enlightenment is just for me or something like that. But, basically, teachings that were preserved and maintained in Southeast Asia are usually called Theravada. And the teachings more from Northern Asia, Tibet, China, and so on, are more like Mahayana. And so how different they are really depends on who you ask. Like the historical, almost by the book answer, is that people in Southeast Asia are less, not people in general in the country, but people in the practice, are less committed to compassion for all beings and that kind of bodhisattva ideal, and are more about becoming free themselves, and that the Mahayana places compassion much more in the center. So I've never totally found that workable division.
Right.
Because I've known so many different teachers within each, and teachers also seem to have personalities, and they're sort of like the massively loving and compassionate people, and they just happen to be Theravadan, and they will talk about taking care of others and helping others. And then within the Mahayana, maybe they're the very ascetic hermit type people, and they will always talk about compassion because it's so embedded in their approach. But when you really look at what they're emphasizing, you think, well, maybe, it's not as central as renunciation or something like that. So I don't know how to do it in a kind of historical divide.
Yeah, well, and certainly in your own work, I mean, it's very obvious that even though you might be affiliated with Theravada practices, you talk a lot about, how these practices are helping to support, a sense of expansiveness or connection with other people and the world around you. So it's almost as if, like, even though they might be centered on yourself, it's like you're getting out of your own way so that ultimately you can be available. Because if you're super contracted and drowning in your own bullshit, then you can't really be compassionate, can you?
I agree.
Yeah. So why don't we? This has been very nice. We've covered so many things in such a quick pace. So, and I'm happy I'm going to be able to fit maybe 5 minutes of meditation with you in before we have to close. So, do you want to take us on a little meditation journey, Sharon?
Sure. I'd say I'm assuming no one's driving and listening to this, right? So if you're in a safe place, sit comfortably, and you can either close your eyes or not. Have your attention just settle into your body. Start by just listening to sounds, whatever sounds may appear, my voice or other sounds. It's a way of relaxing deep inside, allowing your experience to come and go. Of course, we like certain sounds and we don't like others, but we don't have to chase after them to hold on or push away. Just let them come, let them go. And bring your attention to the feeling of your body sitting, whatever sensations you discover. Bring your attention to your hands and see if you can make the shift from the more conceptual level, like the fingers, to the world of direct sensation. Picking up pulsing, throbbing, pressure, whatever it might be. You don't have to name these things, but feel them. And bring your attention to the feeling of your breath. This is just the normal, natural breath. You don't have to try to make it deeper or different. See if you can find the place where the breath is clearest for you or strongest for you. This might be the nostrils or the chest or the abdomen. You can find that place, bring your attention there, and just rest. See if you can feel one breath. And if for some reason the breath doesn't work for you, move your attention throughout your body, starting at the top of your head, and slowly scanning down, feeling the different sensations. Whichever your primary object might be, the really important moment comes after your mind has wandered, which usually is pretty quickly. Our minds jump to the past, or they jump to the future, to judgment or speculation. If you notice this, see if you can let go gently And bring your attention back to the breath or the sensations. Because this is really the crucial transformation, to let go gently, to begin again without judgment, without feeling like a failure. We let go and we start over. And when you feel ready, you can open your eyes, relax.
Wow, thank you. That was really nice, Sharon. So, how can people experience more of that with you? You want to tell us a little bit about what's maybe some retreats or some things that are happening that you're involved in coming up, and maybe websites that people can find out information about your teachings?
My website is SharonSalzberg.com, and hopefully my whole teaching schedule should be on there. I have, so much coming up, and classes in New York City, different 3-day retreats, things like that. So really the best thing is just to check out the website.
Check out the website. Are you regularly leading meditation at Mindful downtown New York?
I have one more scheduled, and then we'll see. I just turned in a manuscript for a new book, so that'll be coming out in May or June.
Oh, excellent.
So
can you share the title of that book?
Yes, that one is called Real Love.
Real Love. Nice. Excellent. All right. This has been such a nice chat. It's been such a pleasure to talk to you, Sharon. Thank you so much for offering your time.
Thank you, really. It's been wonderful.
All right. I'll speak to you soon. Well, I hope you enjoyed that interview with Sharon Salzberg. I certainly enjoyed chatting with her and gaining all of the practical insights that she had to share. So if you'd like to hear more about Sharon and her teachings, just check out SharonSalzberg.com. And then the Insight Meditation Society, which Sharon founded, is actually dharma.org, dharma.org.